This is Beyond a Reasonable Doubt with your hosts, Mark Garrigus and Gary Smith.
Welcome, Gary. Happy Bard Sunday, the Altar of Bard. How are you?
I'm well, Mark. How are you?
It's been a good week. I've got no complaints.
Absolutely.
Back in LA. How about you? You've been quite busy this week, right?
Yeah.
Right at the show.
Yeah, it's absolutely been a busy week. It's been kind of nice getting the cloud cover here in LA. So we've had moderate temperatures for this time of year, so it's been enjoyable.
You know who has not had a good week? Danny Masterson.
No, not so much.
Not had a good week at all. For those who don't know, Danny Masterson was, among his other credits, a actor on the That 70s show.
Right, that's probably his most prominent credit, and a longtime actor in the industry.
47 years old, I think, and he went to trial. These were old allegations, and they were able to, the DA's office, the LA DA's office, tried him once. Phil Cohen, friend of mine in full disclosure, close friend of mine, tried the case the first time, and it was a hung jury tilting towards acquittal. And the judge declined, Charlene Omeda declined to grant what's called a 1385 motion to dismiss. The judge, if after watching the trial, can do an evaluation of the case if it hangs and say, look, I don't think no matter how many times you retry this, you're going to get a different result than a hung jury, and I'm going to exercise my discretion. I'm going to grant a motion to dismiss under 1385. She declined to do that. Between the first trial and the second trial, which ended this week in a 2 counts conviction, there were several rulings that were changed. And number one would have been the prominence of Scientology.
Right.
In the first trial, Scientology, the idea of the intimidation and everything else, that was, for the most part, excluded. Scientology was mentioned, but the full breadth and depth of what the prosecution wanted to present was not allowed in. Second trial, it was.
With both Masterson and all of the accusers all being members. Is that correct?
Correct. And so one of the arguments is, why did they wait so long? Years and years, right. Decades. And the argument was because they were afraid of Scientology is the argument. Then the second crucial area is that the people said they were drugged. But because this was such an old case, there was no toxicology. There was no drugs found. Nobody can point to that. They were just allowed to testify to it that I felt drugged or I felt like that. That may, that to me is, that's going to be up to a judge's discretion. Where I would have a real issue is they allowed in an expert on the drug use or being drugged and what that was. To me, the whole idea of, there's been for years in the federal courts, it started off with this idea of the judge as a gatekeeper for drug science. And, that anybody, both sides could hire experts, but the judge is supposed to, kind of rise above the adversarial science, if you will, or advocacy science. And that has now leaped over to California. We've got a case, Sargon, that allows for the state court judges to do a similar, it originally was what was called Daubert. You do Daubert. And for instance, 25 years ago, mitochondrial DNA. Before you could get into a courtroom, you had to have a hearing. You had to do all dog scent evidence. I went through all of that. In this case, you've got a expert, and I would say, look, you can have an expert on the effects of a drug where you have the predicate for the drug.
Right.
You found it in the tox screen, you found it on their person, something along those lines. You've laid the foundation for it. Here, it's just rank speculation. you are saying decades after the fact, there's no way for the defense to be able to address that because there is no evidence. And so all of a sudden, to quote that old saw by in the and I think it was Don Regan who said the absence of evidence is not evidence. And so here, that old saw has been taken apart.
Right. So in this case, for anyone who's not following, too closely, there's been no toxicology, no drugs found on any of the victims or on the accused, but they allowed in an expert on how certain kinds of drugs would affect people. But as you were saying, why are you having this expert testify if you have no predisposed evidence of those drugs being present? You just have you could just as easily have someone, testify on the facts of how heroin affects people. But in this case, there is no evidence of heroin being involved, right?
Right. And so what I think is that's going to be clearly front and center on the appeal. And Danny Masterson, when the jury came back with the verdict, was sitting at the defense table. He's been out all of this time for years and years and decades, and the judge remanded him into custody, which is standard to some degree in serious cases. He's facing, I've seen 30 years, but it would not surprise me if the prosecutor argues for a life sentence.
Yeah, 30 years has certainly been the number that's been thrown around, and that's him being convicted on only 2 of the 3 charges, I believe, that were in question. But
correct.
Yeah.
Say, and I know, I can imagine that Philip, and I think Sean Hawley tried it the second time with Philip, and I've seen a couple of posts by Sean, and she's obviously understandably upset, and it'll be interesting to see if we hear more on this and more on the things later on. I was. This same week, you actually saw it. There's another Bill Cosby lawsuit.
Yeah, there is former playmate who's now accusing him and alleging similarly that she was drugged as well, right?
Correct. And what year did she say this took place?
I don't want to be wrong, so just give me a moment to pull it up here. But I believe
these cases, if you're wondering, there's things called the look back law, where they can revive cases where the statute of limitations has expired in a civil context. I'm not so sure that stands constitutional muster. It goes back to a U.S. Supreme Court case out of California, by the way, called Stogner, that had to do with the Catholic priest. And you could not revive a criminal case. That's clearly the law, at least as the law is right now. But the dicta there was that, and arguably a civil case you could revive, and there are cases that are making their way up the ladder, so to speak, that will address that. Yeah. What year did you find it, Gary?
I did. I'm glad I looked. I thought it was the 70s, but it was a few years earlier, 1969.
Yeah. So I think, who's his lawyer? Because I saw a quote. Actually, I saw Sarah Azari talking about a quote from his lawyer that, how am I supposed to get evidence? Do I dig graves up to find bodies, or where's the due process in a case from 1969?
Yeah, exactly. I'm trying to find his lawyer's name right now. Let's see here.
Probably the same woman who tried the Santa Monica case would be my guess.
I would agree.
And so, this is going to be a raging issue. You might remember locally, Gary, that the look back law also was used in that Kobasi case. Remember?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. The real estate mogul from La Cañada that we have highlighted here before, where he was alleged from family members to have engaged in some sexual assault as well, and that was able to come in even though it had been many, many years before, right?
Correct. And then there was recently on that there was a settlement, but they asked to strike the verdict, and the judge refused to strike the verdict. He seemed to indicate that based on the evidence he held, he was not going to remove that from, or that he heard, he was not going to remove that from the public record. And I thought that was kind of an interesting way to, they had abandoned their appeal in that case.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm sorry. I'm searching here for Cosby's lawyer. It looks like so far what's coming out from his team is a statement from a spokesperson named Andrew Wyatt.
Andrew's been his spokesperson since the trials at least since the trials in Pennsylvania. There's another, I sent you over one other thing that kind of piqued my interest. Do you have it in front of you? Not the Tate. We'll end up with Tate, but it was the
Sage Steele thing with ESPN.
Right. There was an article, full disclosure, I was quoted in it, but for those do you have a picture of Sage? For those who don't know who Sage Steele is, she is on ESPN. This is a interesting turn of events, and there's a great article in Variety. It's not just great because they quoted me, but Sage, on her own time, had done, I believe it was a podcast. Was it, Gary? I know that I'm testing you here.
It was. No, not at all. Don't worry about it. It was a podcast. I believe it was called Uncut with Jay Cutler, and it was 71 minutes. It was something she recorded on her day off. It was not a part of her job. It was just a media appearance that she did while she was not working in her official capacity as an ESPN spokesperson.
Right. And so I believe they suspended her is what happened. Right. The reason that this is interesting, I mean, you always have and ESPN is a division of Disney. The take by I think it is who's the author? Is it Tatiana?
Tatiana Siegel. Yes.
Yeah, she did a very nice job of laying out the idea that here's Sage Steele, who is working for the Disney, under the Disney rubric, at the same time that she is saying, hey, this is my speech, right? This is my free speech. It's on, as you accurately pointed out, on my day off. Disney is suing Ron DeSantis for Florida and some of the abridgments of what their speech is there. And some of the very arguments that are being made by Disney in Florida adverse to DeSantis are exactly the arguments that Sage Steele is making against ESPN in Connecticut. And I just think the irony, as always, is something to behold.
Yeah, absolutely. And the article that Tatiana wrote points out that, it's a very different venue, Florida to Connecticut, and Sage may benefit as a result of that. And so far, Disney has been trying desperately to get themselves removed from that suit and to pin it just to ESPN and, their home headquarters in Connecticut. But so far, they've been unsuccessful in that endeavor. Yeah,
and Disney and DeSantis have been going back and forth because DeSantis does not like this judge who they've been assigned to. I think he's a federal district court judge appointed by Obama. He's previously invalidated a couple of DeSantis's policy effects. But if I read correctly, and I just sent the article, Gary, I think another irony, I think he recused himself because he's got a close relative who he disclosed owns 30 shares of Disney stock and thinks that might be a conflict. And that's kind of also a raging controversy in the federal courts about judges who are ruling. There was a large study that was done about judges who are ruling when they have a financial interest in the companies that are before the litigants that are before them. So the 30 shares of Disney stock, which I think is probably worth, as of the close last week, somewhere in the neighborhood of less than $5,000, ends up getting rid of the judge that DeSantis wanted to get rid of.
Yeah, for anything that I flubbed in this episode, it's as a result of this particular story, because I had to read that article 2 or 3 times because it's so confusing. 30 shares seems like nothing. The judge denied DeSantis's request that he recuse himself, but then he recused himself over this whatever. I'm glad that a judge is erring on the side of caution, but to deny DeSantis's request only to then recuse himself over what could be argued as a nominal amount of shares by a family member, not in his immediate family, by my reading of the article, is something else.
So then I wanted to end with, and again, full disclosure, he's a client of the office, Andrew Tate. And can you just play just the beginning of that so that I can kind of pivot off it? I don't need more than 10 or 15 seconds and I'll set it up. Andrew, who, as we talked about with Tina, has been held without charges in a Romanian prison, was released after we were involved. And his very fine legal team in Romania was able to get him out on house arrest. He's sitting on house arrest. He's been bugged forever as he says in the tape, to do an interview. And so he does an interview with the BBC. And it was one of those classic, what he would call a legacy media gotcha interview. So let's just play the front of it. It's really worth a watch.
In the interest of saving absolutely everybody's time, I feel like doing a generalized statement to all legacy media inside of the Matrix. And I'm doing it to save their time and mine, as well as protect the minds of the masculine youth for the future. I want to make it very clear that the legacy media, which I enjoyed the company of today, have made a massive mistake and missed a chance to do some genuinely interesting journalism. After being unfairly incarcerated in a Romanian dungeon, I thought that even the BBC, in its absolute arrogance and hubris, would be smart enough to come to me after 6 months, being the first interview I gave to the Matrix, and be smart enough to ask questions people were genuinely interested in. What's it like inside of a Romanian prison cell? How were you treated? Why was a person's liberty deprived of them for 6 months without charge? How is your mental state post your unfair incarceration? Things people are genuinely interested in hearing. But instead, they came with the same old talking points. And I'd like to address all of these talking points to the Matrix media now to prevent this happening again, because it's a monumental waste of everybody's time.
As is, I guess, the journalistic playbook nowadays, the BBC interviewer, and I encourage people to watch this because there's a lot of things that are said about Andrew that are just patently false. And this BBC interviewer certainly did herself no favors because his reach, that's what's so kind of ironic. I don't know who's watching BBC or whatever, but Andrew's reach dwarfs their reach. And my guess is that there is a certain amount of the Streisand effect that he's at least giving them the attention that they otherwise wouldn't get.
Right.
The interesting thing is they took a sentence out of I believe it was a podcast that he did years ago, maybe 8 years ago, and then tried to build the misogyny angle that you always get out of him, and he dismantles it in 13 minutes. It's interesting to watch and see.
Yeah, absolutely. I would encourage everyone to go check that out. You can find it on his Twitter account. It's a good watch. I mean, he does it, as you said, methodically, and he just goes piece by piece and breaks it down. So,
yeah, and surgically dismantles this reporter who was obviously not only over her head, but has
following a narrative.
Yeah, she was adopting the talking points, so to speak, which is never a good idea. Gary, thank you for taking time on Sunday morning as I'm sending you stories right and left.
My pleasure, Mark. Thank you so much for sending them, and thank you for your time as well. We appreciate it, and we'll look forward to hearing more later this week.
You got it. Thanks, Gary.
All right, bye-bye.
Thanks for listening to Reasonable Doubt. Subscribe on YouTube at youtube.com/Reasonable Doubt Podcast.